Okay. I'd like to welcome all of you to the 34th in our series of Zoom lectures sponsored by Congregation KINS. I think everyone present today knows what STEM stands for, and so I'm going to skip that paragraph and simply introduce our speaker for today, Rabbi Aaron Kraft. Rabbi Kraft is the Rosh Chabura of the YU Torah Mission Kollel, and his topic today is Too Much Information, Genetics, Screening, and Halacha. Prior to joining the Kollel, Rabbi Kraft was a member of the high-level Wexner Kollel at Yeshiva University. He has served as assistant Rosh Kollel of YU's Teaneck Summer Kollel. He has served as a rabbinic intern and community Jewish education project scholar for Congregation Abbas Torah in Englewood, New Jersey. He has lectured as a scholar in residence in various shuls around the country and published articles on topics in Jewish law and thought. He holds a BA from Yeshiva College, master's degree from the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, and Smicha from REITs at YU. He also serves as a Dayan Kavua on the Chicago Rabbinical Council, Bezdin. He and his wife Lynn reside here in Lincolnwood with their 5 children. Now my pleasure to turn the program over to Rabbi Kraft, and I do want to remind you that any of you may interrupt the speaker at any point in time if you have a question that you would like to ask. Okay, Rabbi Kraft.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karish, for inviting me and for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to give a special thanks to you, Dr. Karish, for gently pushing for to finally come on and participate in this wonderful program. It's amazing to see just how much learning is being done. And although I myself, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, I was, an English major. So, this whole area of the brain, for me, is not my natural place where I reside. But nonetheless, there's a lot of interesting, topics here, both in terms of Torah and in terms of the secular knowledge. So it's a pleasure to kind of explore this, and I'm happy to do it together with you today.
Great.
And please feel free, for those of you who are more scientifically inclined, if there are even additions or corrections that you might have that are relevant, also feel free, in addition to whatever other questions you want to interrupt with. I'm totally open to that as well. Okay, I know that our time is limited, so there's a lot to talk about. I thought what we could do is maybe talk about the issue of genetic screening and halacha and what the Torah has to say about that. And that can really take the form of a few different types of questions. And so what we'll do is maybe a little bit of introduction, just in the sense that it's interesting to see that already in the times of the Torah and in the times of our sages in the Gemara, there were already indications that people had an understanding of some sort. They didn't call it genetics, but some sort of understanding that genetics was underneath the surface, behind the scenes in our human bodies. And then maybe talk about, I think that, we'll try and focus on the question of genetic screening. It's a very, very important topic for those who are, not yet married and are, engaged in finding, appropriate spouses. So if it's not anyone who's on this Zoom currently, but if it's for children or grandchildren or friends or whatever it might be, it's a very, very important topic to be aware of and to encourage people to look into as well. So what I'll do is I'm going to share my screen a couple times, but for the most part, we'll just kind of talk a little bit together. But so for right now, I think just in terms of an introduction, we want to ask the question, is the concept of genetics something that we find? Is it something that we find in the Torah? And so some had pointed out that there are indications, even if it's not as robust as our genetic knowledge with the human genome and all of the various gene therapies and the new technology that's coming about today. But the pasuk does tell us that Ve'ela toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham, Avraham holid es Yitzchak, that Yitzchak was the child of Avram, and our sages say that Yitzchak looked a lot like Avraham, and that's because when Avraham and Sarah gave birth to Yitzchak, they were very, very old. And people would say, it can't be true. It can't really be that they gave birth to a child at this age. So what Hashem did was he made it very clear that Yitzchak looked like Avraham, so that it would be very obvious that he must be the father. And the there's a sefer by the Chasam Sofer where he writes a very interesting point. This is a well-known medrash that I just quoted, but he says something so fascinating about this medrash. He says, wait a second. If Yitzchak looked like Avraham, from birth, that wouldn't have been proof that Avraham was the father. Why? Because Sarah, when she was impregnated, when she conceived, it could be that she either in her mind, she thought about Avraham's looks, or there might have been some sort of, pictorial image that she could have looked at during during the intercourse or during the conception that would have kind of focused her attention to what Avraham looked like. And those thought processes or those experiences could somehow have, engineered the child, even if it was from a different father, to look like Avraham. So it's just an interesting comment to think about. So it must be that what happened is the child was born, and we don't know who Yitzchak looked like. But what happened is that when it came time to show Yitzchak off to the entire community, to the whole nation, so Hashem made a nace and changed his appearance to make him look like Avraham, so that he used to look like someone else, and now he looked like Avraham, to show that it was really Avraham's child. Like no miracle could have, there's no other way to prove that it was Avraham's child. What a miracle that was to prove that it was Avraham's child. I once heard a talk by Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman, where he pointed out that this comment of the Chasam Sofer is fascinating from a genetic standpoint, because there is a study within I guess a subcategory of genetics called epigenetics, which is the question of whether or not, experiences during conception and pregnancy, these could be, these could be stressors, these could be other types of experiences, if those experiences have the ability to impact on the genetic makeup of the fetus. And so the Chasam Sofer almost, obviously well before his time, seems to maybe be like alluding to this, just kind of like from his own thought process that it must be that there are other ways to impact the genetics of the child. So the only way to prove that Avram was really the father was not if the child was born looking like Avram, because that could be done by whatever impact or whatever influences took place during pregnancy. But if it was that he was born looking like someone else and then he changed to be looking like Avraham, so then that's a proof that it must be that Avraham was the real father. So this Rabbi Reichman, kind of in jest, but to put it out there that it sounds like the Chasam Sofer was like the precursor to this concept of epigenetics, maybe identifying this in the Chumash itself. But in more seriousness, there is a piece in the Talmud. There's a piece in the Talmud which definitely does seem to indicate that our sages understood the concept of genetics to some degree, and the fact that our physical body makeup is a function of what we received, something that we received from our parents. Now, how do our sages indicate this? The Gemara talks about in Maseches Yevamos. The Gemara says that there was a case where there was a particular woman, and she had several sisters, and they each had a child. They each had a male. And what happened was the woman number one had a child. The child was given a bris milah, and as a result of the trauma from the bris milah, the child died. And then the second sister had a child, and the same thing happened. They had the bris milah on the 8th day, and the child passed away. And then on the third sister had a child, and the same thing happened. And the child passed away after receiving the bris milah. And now the fourth sister, when she had her son, she went to the Rav and she said, all three of my sisters, their child passed away after having undergone a bris milah. So do I have to go ahead and give my son a bris milah, or can I assume that there's some sort of inherent disease of sorts that in our family, that the children are subject to extreme danger during the bris milah, and I want to have my child without the bris milah. I want my child to not have to get a bris milah because of that. What does this sound like? Obviously the Gemara doesn't tell us what the nature of the death was, what the nature of the illness was, but the notion that the bris milah caused some sort of problem is, it's very possibly, there are those who have suggested that this is perhaps, a hemophilia type of issue, that there was some issue in terms of the ability for the wounds to be healing on the child. And when they had their bris milah, that was their first time being wounded, and the blood wasn't clotting properly or whatever else might have happened. And as a result of this condition, the children of all of these consecutive sisters, they were all passing away. And then the fourth sister says, well, wait a second, I'm seeing a pattern here. My sister's child had the problem. My other sister's child had the problem. My other sister's child had the problem. And therefore, I think my child might have the problem. And the Gemara says, you learn from this that there is a problem which is passed through women. There is such a thing as a problem that's passed through women that could impact the health of the child and their ability to be circumcised and healed properly. And therefore, it is permitted in certain circumstances not to give a bris milah to that child. And I will share my screen with you briefly, so you can see that if this is indeed talking about a hemophilia type of issue, so hemophilia is actually something which is passed along through the X chromosome. So here I'm working off of this source sheet, which if anyone is interested, I'm happy to share. But I generally find that on Zoom, if we have a source sheet up the whole time, it's like a little bit harder for people to kind of be engaged. It's much easier to look at my face. You know what I'm saying? So like, so I'm just going to share the screen as is, but I'm working off of this source sheet. And here, I'm going to show you this diagram. Here you have the Gemara in Yevamos. And under the Gemara in Yevamos, you have a diagram of how the genetics of hemophilia function. So you can see that that this is a disease that is carried by the X chromosome. So you have two scenarios here, where one scenario where the mother is not a carrier. I'm if you can see my mouse kind of on the right side of the screen hovering over this fine caricature of a woman. And then you have the red father, who is someone who has hemophilia. So you have out of the four genes that are being passed on in the gender side of things. So you have the XY of the father and the XX of the mother. So the father is going to pass on his X gene, and the mother will pass on, the father can pass on either an X or a Y, and the mother is going to pass on, the X. So if you have four children, the likely scenarios, again, these are all just probabilities, but the four different scenarios of all these four genes being passed in the four different permutations. So you find that if the father, anytime the father, if the father passes on his X gene that has hemophilia, the child will at least be a carrier. In order for the child to have the disease, the child would have to have either two X chromosomes with the disease, or the child would have to have the X chromosome from his father and be a male. But you see that the X chromosome is the female chromosome, and that passes along the hemophilia disease. You can see that when if you move over to the left side of the screen, if the mother is a carrier, so then it's actually possible for a child to be stricken with the actual disease, because he might inherit that X chromosome that is carrying the disease. Whereas the only way where you're going to where you have a significant probability of a child having the disease is if you have the father and the mother's both having the mother being a carrier and the father having the disease. Would be, then you would increase your chances significantly that the X chromosome that is going to be handed down could result in a hemophilia case. In order for a female to have it, you'd have to have both the father and the mother. The mother would have to at least be a carrier, and the father would have to have the disease in order to each pass down the X chromosome that would be a carrier, and then create an instance of hemophilia in the female. Now, the goal here is not to go through all of the genetic permutations. The goal here is just to show that if you can see from these diagrams and some of these different iterations, that the disease of hemophilia is something that is carried on in the female genetic makeup, in the X chromosome. And that seems to be what the Gemara says. When the Gemara says that it's passed along in the mothers, that was perhaps what the Gemara is alluding to. And again, they obviously didn't have the same scientific understanding of this, but that's something that is at least alluded to. That is kind of by means of introduction to the concept of genetics and how we see some indications of it in the Torah. But let's talk about the actual ramifications for us And there are really two types of questions or two types of issues that we want to address. There is.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah, sure.
If I'm not mistaken, the father cannot pass the hemophilia gene to his offspring because the father is always going to, at least not to a son anyway, is always going to pass the Y chromosome to a son.
Correct. If it's a son, the father cannot pass the disease. It has to come. It has to be. You're correct. If I misspoke, you're 100% correct. If it's a son, the father cannot pass the disease onto his son. The mother would have to be the carrier and would have to pass on. If she's a carrier, she would have to pass on the disease that's carrying it. If she has it because both of her chromosomes have it, so then she would pass it on to her son regardless. That's correct. Okay. So here for the question that we want to discuss today in terms of screening, and again, hemophilia is like, it's not your classic example of what we're looking for when we talk about genetic screening, but when we talk about genetic issues among, within the Jewish community, so there are obviously well-known particular diseases that seem to be more prevalent amongst Jewish genetics. And there are really two things to talk about. There's the screening from the standpoint of trying to identify or see if a person is carrying a disease, right, in a recessive fashion, that they themselves don't necessarily have the disease, but they might have the gene in a recessive manner that they could be a carrier for that disease, such that if their partner is also a carrier of a particular disorder or disease, that the two of them together will have either a significantly higher chance of having offspring who will not just be a carrier of the disease, but will actually have the disorder or ailment affect them personally. So this is in the realm of recessive genetic scanning. There's also genetic scanning, which could actually be not searching for recessive genes, but actually searching for genes that might indicate issues that may impact us ourselves, like for example, like a BRCA gene. That a BRCA gene, if we're a carrier, it's not guaranteed that it will lead to an instance of cancer. But if we have the BRCA gene, there is certainly much more to be concerned about, and there might be treatments that we undergo with now having that knowledge that we ourselves, may have, a gene that could lead to that. So there's the recessive piece of it, and there's the dominant piece of it. So let's talk about the recessive. I don't know if we'll have time to get to both, but let's talk about the recessive. And for me, that's a little bit more interesting, but that's just me. So let's talk about the recessive. Here's the question is that we know that if two parents are the carriers, so we're going to use, we'll use Tay-Sachs as our example, because that's really the first discussions that you find in the halachic authorities, in the poskim. You find that they talk about the Tay-Sachs disease. Now, if you have both parents being a carrier, so then you have at least 1/4 of a chance that that a child that comes from this marriage will have the disease. So obviously the chance, it could be greater, and it could be that it doesn't happen. But in terms of probability, if both parents are carriers of recessive genes, so the chances are 1 out of 4 children could actually be impacted by the disease itself. And in certain circumstances, like Tay-Sachs, that's a very tragic, very, very, very difficult situation. So the poskim were asked, once it became possible to kind of identify genes and the genetic makeup of individuals, are we obligated to go ahead and do so? Are we obligated to go and try to figure out if we are carriers or if we have recessive genes of various diseases which are more prominent within the Jewish community? And this was asked to a number of different halachic authorities. And in general, the response was pretty much unanimous, that 100% people before getting married should go ahead and undergo some sort of genetic screening to try and get a better handle on what their genetic makeup is, specifically with regards to being carriers or in a recessive fashion for various ailments or disorders. The thing that's interesting is that there was a disagreement about how that should go about being done and what should be done with that information. So everybody agrees that the information should be gathered. The question is, how should it be gathered and what to do with it? So for example, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked this question, and he said, 100%, you have to get tested. You have to find out if you're a carrier for Tay-Sachs. However, he said, one should not be told that they are or they're not a carrier. It shouldn't become public information. You yourself shouldn't even know about it, because if people are told that they are carriers of various genes for various disorders, you know what might happen? The general public will not understand what that means. And they'll say, oh, you're a carrier of Tay-Sachs? I never want to come close to you because that could mean, I don't know, you might be contagious and you might, kill me with some sort of disease, because they won't understand the science of what it means to be a carrier of a disease. And it could get blown out of proportion that people will feel unsafe around you, or people will say, don't marry you, even though being a carrier is not necessarily at all something that could ever have a practical ramification on anyone's life. Nonetheless, people will blow that information out of proportion, and it will come back to negatively impact the carrier. So therefore, we need to figure out a system where people can be tested and the data can be collected, but not in a way that will taint the reputation of any of the parties involved. And this became the sort of basis for the institution of Dor Yesharim. Many of you probably heard of Dor Yesharim, which is a genetic testing institution. That the way it works is that when people, someone is interested in getting married, you go get a blood test, you register with Dor Yesharim, get a blood test. They run various tests in terms of looking at all the different genetic aspects of your makeup. They create a profile under your name, and under your name, they have your entire genetic makeup in terms of what things you're carriers for, what you're not, et cetera, et cetera. And they leave that profile. That profile is not shared with anybody. You do not have any information. You do not get any results back yourself. Your profile is there. And then when you want to go and marry person X, so that person also should have a profile in Dor Yesharim. You call up Dor Yesharim, you give them your names, they look at your profile, they look at the potential spouse's profile, they match them together, and they come back and they say, you're either genetically compatible or you're genetically incompatible. They don't tell you who has what, who's a carrier for what, why you're compatible, why you're not compatible. No information is given. They just tell you, yes, you're compatible, no, you're not compatible. There are other institutions that actually will give you more information, and they will actually give you, they'll tell you what you're carriers for, what you're not carrier for. There's the Sarnoff Center for Jewish Genetics. There's something called J-Screen. There are various ways of going about it, but Rav Moshe's way was to keep it secret. Rabbi Bleich, who is one of the Rosh Yeshiva in YU, he's also a very prominent medical halacha expert. I'm sure his name has come up in this Zoom throughout the 33 previous STEM lectures. I would imagine someone has brought him up at one point or another. He says he does not agree with Rav Moshe on this at all. He says Rav Moshe's entire premise is that this is going to create some sort of stereotype and some sort of tarnishing of people's reputations. And he says that's exactly the problem. People need to understand how genetics work. People need to understand what the science really looks like. And therefore, you shouldn't create this austere, this mysterious sort of like, oh, he's a carrier, he's not a carrier, no one knows. It's like very secretive, because then you just kind of feed this terrible notion in the public eye that like, this is these are serious, tarnishings and, terrible ailments and things that no one wants to know about. We have to keep secret. He says, no, if you understand the science, a carrier is totally, is totally innocuous, unless you've married someone who's also a carrier, in which case then you have issues that could become more serious. But until that point, there's no problem. So don't hide anything. This is not a secret. People should be educated about what it means to become genetically tested and what it means to be a carrier versus having a recessive gene versus a dominant gene, et cetera, and what the proper mode of action is in the event that you have, once you have this information. So that was Rabbi Bleich's opinion. Rabbi Willigan YU says, I don't care if you know what you have or don't have. I don't care if you're dominant, recessive, whatever it is, if you're Dor Yesharim or if you're other things, just everyone needs to get tested, because it's so easy to be able to do our part in preventing potentially deadly, terrible, tragic illnesses. So if we don't do our parts, then we are being negligent. we will, I know it's, we're approaching the half an hour mark, so I don't want to, go over. I just want to share, one more element of the next step of this question, because, and then we're not going to talk about dominant genes today, but we'll talk about just, finish up this, this piece of it, that when it comes to now you have your knowledge, you have your information, either through Dor Yesharim or one of the other things, and you know who's recessive, who's not, whatever it might be. So let's say somebody finds out that they and their their potential spouse are both, carriers. So now they have to start thinking about, well, what's the appropriate response? Even, sometimes even more difficult than that. What happens if sometimes, thank God, and hopefully it doesn't happen too much, and it hasn't happened that much, but every once in a while there are margins of error. There have been instances where even people who have undergone genetic testing and told that they were, proper, appropriate matches and compatible, there were mistakes, and they ended up not being genetically compatible, and then end up with, a pregnancy where they recognize that the fetus actually, Rahman al-Islam, does have, one type, a certain ailment or what have you. So what do we do with the information? What kind of, what's the appropriate response? So some of the poskim say that if you're not compatible, then don't get married. And if you're already married, get divorced, right? That's it. No choice, nothing, there's nothing to do. Other poskim say, no, if you're not compatible, that doesn't mean that you can't get married, or that doesn't mean that you have to get divorced once you are married. What it means is that you have to now use, more, a little bit more of a prudent approach to reproduction. Sometimes that might mean not having a child. And then the questions come up of, can one use birth control for this reason? Is this a good reason to use birth control? Is this not a good reason to use birth control? And various halakhic authorities, have various opinions. Some say, I don't care. There's a chance that the child will be healthy, a chance the child won't be healthy. That's not a good enough reason to use birth control. Take your chances. That's what you decided to do. And others will say, no, you can of course use birth control to avoid the potential of having a child who would, be ill with certain diseases. And again, everybody should ask their personal Rav. Another aspect of genetics, which with this will conclude, in this type of circumstance where a couple finds themselves, in a scenario where maybe they are not genetically compatible, in the sense that there is potential for a child to be born with some sort of genetic disease. So we actually have new technology, which allows us, called, PGD technology, which allows us to actually go ahead and to alter the genetic makeup of the egg or the sperm in order to create a fetus which will not have the genes which are potentially problematic that could cause serious illness. So this is, because of this technology, some of the poskim actually, recommend that this would be the way to go, that one can actually engage in PGD in order to, alter the genetic makeup and make sure that the child is not, does not have the detrimental genes that would cause, cause issues. PGD is really its own topic. Like we could have a whole shear on this, on this methodology, because, there's questions of, sperm going to waste. There's questions of whether or not, is this child considered like your child, or is it considered, if it's created in a, in a laboratory, so to speak, if, the conception is the fertilization is taking place in the laboratory, who's considered the father, who's considered the mother, lots of different questions that can, come up there. When you have embryos that are, that go to waste, is that a problem? So there are lots of different issues, but in the end of the day, many poskim are fans of this type of technology. It becomes a little touchy when someone says, by the way, once you're making sure my child doesn't have Tay-Sachs, could you also that recessive, that dominant brown eyes, like, can you just take that one out so that like the kid has the blue eyes? Like, I'd much rather the blue-eyed child than the brown-eyed, and also, once you're at it, can you check to make sure like the kid could be like 6 feet tall and all that. So that becomes a question, how much, leeway can you take in the PGD? But for sure, from the standpoint of removing the genes that are carriers of detrimental or challenging diseases, so there the poskim are definitely lenient. Just as a word of a conclusion, that one of the things that I think is true of this in this topic, but it's really true of the entire theme of your shiurim, of your lectures that you're getting together each week. And that is that one of the things that we have to recognize is the Rebbe Shalom gave us like tremendous ability to be able to understand the niflos habore, just the amazing way that he created us, created the world, understanding the science and the medicine and the technology, all of these things. It just gives us such an insight into the genius and the chachma of the Rebbe Shalom, and how we have to feel so privileged that he granted us the means to understand, even if it's just a glimpse of the understanding, that he gave us the means to understand it, and he gave us the challenge. And he said to us, Melu ha'aretz v'kivshuha. The Rav Soloveitchik used to say that was the Rebbe Shalom telling us that we are meant to come and go into laboratories, and we're meant to investigate and understand and try to really break down the brilliance of the beautiful creation that God provided us with. And this is really just, one, like drop in the bucket of our abilities and of our privilege that we have. But really, this year is a testimony to that, and it's people who are pursuing this Melu ha'aretz v'kivshuha to really understand the niflos habore, and that's a tremendous thing in our avodas Hashem. So Mirza Hashem, we should all be healthy, and we should all encourage people to get genetically tested to make sure that we can do whatever interventions are necessary to make sure that we are healthy and our children are healthy. But at the same time, we should also continue to appreciate the niflos habore that Hashem has embedded into this world and given us the privilege to take part in. And I thank you all for inviting me and for your participation this afternoon. Have a wonderful day, and I'm happy to stay on for a minute if anyone has any last minute questions.
Does anyone have a question for Rabbi Kraft? If not, I wanted to mention one thing. I liked your little charts because they actually ended up being applicable to me many years ago, not for any terrible disease, thank God, but for color blindness. And as it turned out, my mother's father, after whom I named, my mother's father was colorblind. My mother was a carrier, and my mother's sons had a 1 in 4 chance or her children had a 1 in 4 chance of becoming colorblind. It turned out we beat the odds because my brother and I are both colorblind. And but the chart really did tell the story very well. So I want to thank you. That was a fascinating presentation, and you did a great job on it. Hope everyone here enjoyed it. I want to share my screen for just one moment. Let's see if I can get to it real quickly to show you what's coming up. Okay, so the next 3 STEM lectures are shown on the screen here. Hopefully you can see that. The one next week on June the 8th, that is a Tuesday. And then you'll note the 7 lectures after that are going to be on Mondays because unfortunately I have a teaching assignment 7 weeks in a row, Tuesday at 12 o'clock for an outside institution. So here's what's coming up. Rabbi Noach Light, who is from Boca Raton, is going to talk on Are You My Mother? Exploring halachic implications of surrogacy. Rabbi Shimon Feder, also from Boca, is going to talk about living a balanced life. And Dr. William Gewirtz, who presented a few weeks ago, is talking about something that many of us have had to deal with, the international dateline. Like if you want to go to Hawaii or other places, some people say you should go, you shouldn't go. And so Dr. Gewirtz has a little bit different perspective on the dateline than some other people do. And so he's going to talk about, is a dateline a logical necessity? It's really just a kind of a made up thing, and it's very arbitrary where it is. So do we need it? And tune in and we'll find out in about 2 weeks. So again, thanks to all of you who have attended today. Thank you again, Rabbi Kraft, and hope you all have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.